Resume after lunch. We're on matter 2 and it's issue 4 and it's around employment and economic growth for the island plan strategy, reflecting a number of questions that we had identified. I think everybody who's participating in this first part of the afternoon session has been at the previous morning session, apart from I've got a gentleman back. Are you affiliate? Do you know Mr. Long? You're with Mr. Are you on? Okay. Have you got a name plate? Okay. So singling you out, you are a new face. But just for your benefit, Mr. Gentleman. So, Mr. Gentleman, just for your benefit, to introduce myself, David Spencer. I'm one of the 2 examiners looking at the soundness of the submitted island planning strategy, along with my colleague, Mr. Steen. We're also talking about employment growth this afternoon, and then we're going to move on to matter 8 around specific employment policies later on. I don't know if you've observed any of this morning's kind of session, so it's in the format, it's relatively informal. We'll have some questions for the council. People can join in the discussion where it's related to their particular representations, and then make a particular point. At some point you'll get a nameplate. It is the convention, and I'll try to bring you in at an appropriate welcome examination sessions. Okay, so if we turn back to the agenda and the issues for matter 2, a part of the plan, or the plan's role, is to support sustainable growth on the island. One of the key policies to do this will be policy E1 plan, which identifies various issues, including effectively a quantum of employment land for the plan period. A series of effectively end up as site allocations within this document. But in terms of the first item we wanted to look at was the soundness of that employment land supply within the policy. I think that amounts to just over 29 hectares. And from reading the council's matter statements, I mean, is it reasonable to conclude that in effect most of that employment supply now either in the pipeline or shortly, subject to section 106 or other mechanisms, about to join a kind of a consented pipeline?
Thank you, sir. Yes, that's absolutely fair and correct. As set out in 2.25, one of the sites is either subject to or has recently been subject to a planning application or a forthcoming action. So that absolutely is the case. It's effectively just securing that pipeline of supply, and obviously the policy sets out the size of the sites in hectares. Obviously, the actual square meterage of floor space that will be delivered on those employment sites remains to be seen, and obviously that will often be dictated by the occupier and the type of occupier that goes into that space. So, yeah.
And then further looking at the employment land study that accompanies the plan and the various scenarios that it's looked at, which obviously are sorts of scenarios that are set out in the planning practice guidance in terms of things to be looking at in terms of labour demand, labour supply, past trends, etc. The figures, as we see them in the employment land study, are probably slightly lower than what's put forward policy E1 in terms of the aggregate supply from all of the proposed, I'll call them proposed allocations for short, but those sites for shorthand. Whether that approach is justified, whether it aligns with wider kind of economic objectives to the island, and whether we should be concerned that could be a potential oversupply of employment land. Might be difficult to address through this plan if they're coming through the planning system separately, but whether kind of that's something we need to have a weather eye on in terms of the balance of jobs and homes.
Yeah, thank you, sir. And I think it's an interesting situation where we have that level of employment land in the development pipeline, either consented or planning process. So certainly from a plan making perspective, we think sound and effective to make sure that that is then secured through policy. Obviously, we can't guarantee that all of those sites will come forward in the shape and form that they either get consented or potentially are allocated for. But that's again potentially for something when we're looking into future iterations of the plan and seeing what's happened with some of those. And I think drawing a parallel back to perhaps the core strategy in 2012, which also allocated land for employment and for housing, some of those employment allocations come forward. So again, it's that that they're there because that's what we're aware of and that's what's being promoted by the sector. But also we're also conscious that things can change and the future iterations of the plan can reflect that. I think in terms of the points around labour demand and the housing requirement in the plan, absolutely the plan study looked at the level of residential development that would be needed to kind of support the level of growth that's potentially allocated. And it came to the conclusion that because the housing number in the plan wasn't a ceiling, effectively not saying it's cut off, there is room to deliver more, and there is the opportunity to support that level of but obviously that is on the basis that all of those sites would definitely come forward. And also some of those sites may have lower amounts of floor space on them because of the type of employer that comes forward, and there's characteristics around sites around the nature of occupiers that will dictate job densities, etc., which is very difficult to pin down. And also when you look at that labour demand scenario, also looking at things like current unemployment rates. So obviously they've changed recently. So and that's an existing labour supply that's already on the island, doesn't necessarily need new housing to drive it. So that's the approach we've sought to take, and from a plan making perspective, we think that's a sound and effective way to secure that pipeline. Then obviously conscious that may change in future iterations.
And in terms of the employment land study itself, obviously it's undertaken in 2022 by ICINI. I've read references to it being effectively kind of Freeport off. If I use that old phraseology from probably a time when you shouldn't use on or off anymore, but I'm going to call it Freeport off. Does see the Freeport has now been designated? Does that have a bearing for the kind of the employment land study evidence, or we're still at a position where it's still too early to kind of think through what or understand what the implications of the Freeport might fully mean?
Thank you. I think your last point is where we're at as plan makers, certainly from a Freeport perspective, and you'll see from the kind of plan we included in our response to 2.26. None of the Freeport designated sites are on the island, those that would benefit from the potential tax relief and the planning relaxations. So certainly the island's role is probably very much going to be in terms of supply chain and seeing where some of those kind of down the line benefits may support some of those sites which are further afield. So I think our perspective is very much it's a little bit too early to be able to pin down exactly what that Freeport status means for the island. However, we have included in E1 and also E2 mention of the Freeport, and we've got specific Freeport policy as well to make sure that if that does crystallise over time, then at least we've got a hook in the plan, and whether that potentially needs a future SPD to pick up some of the benefits that may crystallise out of the Freeport, specifically for the island, would at least then have the policy hook to be able to do that. But certainly from our perspective at this stage, we feel it's a little bit too early to be definitive about what those benefits of the Freeport would be for the island.
Would it be reasonable to conclude if we came to view there is a headroom or a buffer in the employment supply or the employment land identified in policy E1, part of that could have a role in providing flexibility for early Freeport supporting development if that was necessary?
Yes, absolutely. That's you could certainly conclude that in terms of that position of oversupply, and obviously we've got a couple of the residential allocations as well, which have elements of potential mixed use to them as well. So I think plan as a whole provides that potential surplus capacity that would be able to look at the potential benefits of the Freeport. Again, which we'll probably come on to this afternoon and perhaps tomorrow, in terms of the spread of those employment sites of the island. They're not particularly located in one place. They are in different areas, some of which are obviously close to those connections to the mainland, which will be potentially really important for those supply and chain businesses when you're looking at the Freeport sites in Portsmouth, Southampton and further afield.
Thank you. And then I'll bring in other people. Further question for the council in terms of looking at particularly a kind of a labour kind of supply scenario. You referred to obviously Mr. Brewer, kind of potential changes in kind of economically active on the island, but in terms of jobs to kind of support future island population, I think look at the employment land study, it has looked at the consequences if it was the standard method. It's also looked alternatively, I think it calls it a constrained scenario, which is a little bit more than 4553, but not significantly. Again, I think as I understand the figures, the kind of we call it the constrained scenario, the labour supply is around just shy of about 16 hectares. So the plan's building in potentially quite a buffer of employment supply, and whether that's kind of reasonable or realistic that will come to fruition.
I think I'll go back to the original point in terms of what the allocations in E1 are, which they are sites that are coming through the development pipeline. They are being promoted by the sector either in the form of applications or they already have consent. So that's the supply that the market is delivering effectively through permissions, and therefore that's what we're seeking to secure. And obviously if that does provide an oversupply, then that's the case. But I think from our perspective in plan making, if we were to ignore any of those permissions, much is the same way as housing, we wouldn't necessarily ignore any permissions that are in place. They do form part of the supply that we've got. So that's the approach we're taking. But I think there are a number of changing characteristics when you're looking at employment land and employment need. We've mentioned the Freeport being one of them. We don't know quite what that's going to mean for the island yet. So again, there's some built-in security around that. And again, some of the sites that we've allocated there have other uses on them as well. So Nicholson Road being one example, there is an element of residential on that site. So whilst we've got 14.7 hectares in the allocation, not all of that is going to be job creating uses. And that goes back to my earlier point around floor space. And so the floor space in each of those sites, which we don't necessarily know at this point, will be the key marker in terms of that job density.
Thank you. If I can bring in other people, was it Mr. Salmon first, and then we'll work our way along?
Thank you, sir. In terms of the level of employment land that's actually planned for, I think it's the amount is welcomed, although I would argue for more. And the reason I argue for more is to provide flexibility and choice of sites for prospective investors on the island. What the island needs is investment from off island onto the island to lead to more sustainable, higher salary jobs. We have a situation that's actually sort of outlined in the first part of the island planning strategy, where you have an aging population, you have young people that get qualified and move away from the island, and you have a multiplier effect where people are moving away, the population is getting older, the Isle of Wight's at risk of becoming Britain's largest old people's home, and it needs rectifying, it needs readdressing. I act for the owners of Sandown Airport. The Sandown Airport site is one of those that is proposed to be allocated. We have had 2 refusals of planning permission on that site, precisely for the uses that are proposed as part of the allocation. The last refusal was basically on the position of a bus stop, whether a bus stop could be provided. There is a mismatch, I think, within the authority between the aspirations for delivering employment and allocating sites and actual development control, and that's something that's frustrating. That issue is now subject of a separate appeal, and obviously that will be determined on its own merits. But what that leads to is a lack of confidence, and a lack of confidence that prospective investors can actually get the permissions that they need to actually bring money from the outside and deliver the jobs that are actually required. On the basis of that, I actually think there needs to be an even bigger buffer. There needs to be more land allocated for employment uses, yes, in terms of the flexibility of the types of uses that they have or promoting, but you need to offer that choice to prospective investors. Of those other sites that are allocated, they have their own constraints. Nicholson Road, I think, is mostly owned by the Isle of Wight Council themselves. There's been a resolution to grant permission that goes back a number of years. I can't remember when that was. Yeah, sorry, 2018. Thank you. And it's just sat there. There's been no legal agreement that's signed or whatever. So again, there's a lack of confidence in the process in terms of delivering those sites. And you could go through a number of those. They're all constrained. I'm not saying they shouldn't be allocated. I'd rather they were allocated, but they've got to be taken forward in a means that's delivered some proactive work in the Isle of Wight Council and actually getting the permissions in place to actually deliver those.
In follow-up to that, Mr. Salmon, I'm just reminding myself in terms of what's in the employment land study, which is really the key piece of evidence underpinning policy E1 as I see it. I mean, that looked at kind of labour demand. So what's kind of the sector telling us is needed to kind of support their growth over the plan period, and those figures are lower than what's in policy E1. If you look at past trends, that's lower than what's in E1, although you might invite me to take a view, well, past trends have been affected by various factors. I mean, what evidence or where should we be thinking, well, this is potentially a kind of an undersupply that we need to this is potentially not sound and more land needs to be released.
I think Mr. Brewer made the point eloquently in terms of we don't know what the market is going to be in the future. We've had the implications of COVID, we've got changing markets or whatever. However, the bigger picture here is the past market of the Isle of Wight based on tourism. We've had some good manufacturing, we've had some good technology-based industries, but unless you encourage those and encourage further growth of those and an investment, from my point of view, is providing the choice of sites, you are going to be in that ever decreasing circle of a lack of investment and decline. I have 3 sons, 2 of which are looking to move off of the island. They're both qualified. Said it all.
Thank you. Mr. Long next, please.
I'd share what Mr. Salmon was saying. I don't dispute kind of the allocations in the list, but I do think we need to provide more. And I know that probably flies in the face of evidence. The reason I say that is, in relative scale, the allocations set before us, Nicholson Road, has been in the planning system for a long time. That's quite a big site for the Isle of Wight. It might not be for mainland counterparts, but that's quite a big site to build out. Similar, even when you get into the +1 hectare territory, that's quite big for the Isle of Wight from an employment purpose. What the employment land study advocates is there's likely to be demand for smaller units, and when you put smaller units in an Isle of Wight scale, it means kind of micro industrial sites or employment sites. And I think that's how businesses operate. If you look at the scale of kind of the larger shed ethos where employment sites evolves from in mentality, you know, big sites, big employment sheds, big storage distribution, etc. The Isle of Wight doesn't operate like that terribly well. And when you look at these big sheds in like the tech industries, they're a one-off, unique user occupier that are slightly rare as hen's teeth that come to the island. Vestas, GKN, you know, you get some, but they're very rare. They haven't come to fruition over the plan cycle since 2012. So to use these big sites without having allocations of smaller sites pepper potted throughout to help the indigenous industry on the Isle of Wight grow creates a problem. And that, I think that's symptomatic of why, say, for instance, Nicholson Road, which was in a core strategy allocation, and some others, why they haven't been developed, because we don't have those big, large-scale employers. We should certainly roll the carpet out for these big sites to happen, no shadow of a doubt. But what we do need is smaller sites. And when I mean smaller sites, I do mean small sites. Whether that can be wrapped up in the other policy structures, there's mention of in E2 intensification expansion of existing industrial sites to give that fluid approach. Welcome the council's comments on that. But equally, we don't want to rob Peter to pay Paul with other detailed policies, which will probably go through parts of the hearing against agricultural land grade or environmental buffering, etc. We've got to be careful that the issue of the composite issues doesn't erode the result to advocate smaller employment sites coming forward. The other point I wanted to make, sir, was I think the employment land market has changed. It's quite difficult to be prescriptive of whether employment is an E use, a B2 use, or a B8 use. And I know that's easy in definition terms in NPPF and glossary, etc. But actually, mixed use employment generation is slightly beyond and broader than that. It does involve retail, it does involve tourism, leisure, hospitality. And so I'm a little, how do we retain flexibility within the policy E1 approach for mixed uses? Not necessarily residential, I'm not going into that mixed use territory, but its widest and broadest definition for employment rather than just solely curtailing it to the E's, the B's uses. I think it goes much broader than that within our modern employment structures. I think that's super important because that's how our indigenous employment land has evolved. We're not London, we're not Guildford, not Reading, but we need to grow it. And to grow it, we need to start small and build it up.
Thank you, Mr. Long. So if I could sort of summarise, so it may be the sort of the figure in E1 may be broadly, I'm trying to capture what you're saying, that may be an appropriate figure, but actually it's the detail of how you then deliver it, whether it's through those larger sites or...
I think we need, it's a bit like the housing, you know, the government says we need large and small scale sites and then give a percentage, don't they, you know, and small sites should be 10% of an allocations process. And actually, I think on the island, from employment purposes, as a percentage, it should probably be more than the large scale sites in hectareage. And that, because we are where we are, and the kind of narrative for the economy is quite clear, is we are struggling as Ireland, to be a forward-looking plan and be proactive and encouraging to roll out the investment, to attract investment. We need to give every opportunity to business to come to the Isle of Wight. And actually, the stretch of water isn't a problem. It's a blessing in disguise. And actually, if you embrace it, there's no barrier at all. I have an office on the island. I've got an office in Winchester, an office in Oxford, and one in Petersfield. There's no barrier about travel or cost. It's just a mindset. And once you start to grab that and change the philosophy of the island, why we always kind of dig ourselves into the grave economically through words and emotion, if you change the narrative through a plan, you start to speak positive language and you start to roll out the proverbial red carpet. But you can only do that if you map out an allocations process that is easily available and is risk-free to an employer or an investor. And you do that by allocations or having a very open policy that says we invite business. We are open for business. Please come over here and do that. And I think there's just some language in there that doesn't provide that positivity, and also to help the indigenous business of the islands grow. I'm not, again, I don't dismiss the allocations as in the scale, but I just think we're missing a trick here to be thinking about what we actually need to propel ourselves.
Thank you for that. Is it Mr. Gentleman?
Thanks very much, sir. I just wanted to touch on a couple of points. One that I thought was interesting was that although the evidence suggested one thing, the Isle of Wight Council were keen to look at that evidence and over-provide employment land in their eyes. I just wonder why that doesn't seem to follow suit with housing. I know we're not on housing at the moment, but I thought it was an interesting point to acknowledge that policies change, planning permissions fall out, and allocations move. And that is something that should follow through in every echelon of this plan, which I don't think it does at the moment. Just to echo on David's comments, lots of employment land on the island is centred around very small offices and small light commercial units that are used in that way. And the spread here is all about large scale allocations, which require big infrastructure spend to make them viable as a prospect. And there is quite simply not enough spread across the island with smaller elements that are more suitable. On a micro level, I live in Bembridge at the eastern tip of the island. There are absolutely no light industrial units available there, none whatsoever, for any kind of office use, which is really quite interesting. I work from home. Many people on the island work from home. And actually the opportunity for me to expand my business into a smaller premises is quite limited without wanting to travel large distances, which I don't particularly want to do. So I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Mr. Farrell, please.
Yeah, I was going to really echo everybody else's thing, but from my side of it, flexibility. Without flexibility in those employment uses, you've got nothing. You've got no inward investment. There isn't an investor out there that will bring into these big sites without flexibility and security of those sites. So there has to be a much more open conversation to be had on that, to be able to say, it's not just narrowed into a B1 use over 15 hectares. It's never going to be built, not on the island. So that's really all I wanted just to echo what that was saying.
Thank you. Come back to the council on some of these points that have been raised in terms of, we'll obviously come on some of the individual sites, but just as a sort of a matter of kind of strategy and principle and approach in terms of the amount of employment land to be provided through the plan and broadly in kind of what form. Feels a slight element of kind of bottom up here in terms of sites that may have been in the pipeline or known about for some time. in terms of looking at from the employment lands studies kind of analysis and understanding of the market, are there any kind of, I don't know, policies or interventions or kind of support from, I don't know, the local enterprise partnership or other, the council itself that would enable some of these sites to take on or come forward in some of the more, sort of more flexible way that some people are saying in terms of potentially catching a large fish to kind of take some of these sites in one or two goes might be challenging, but smaller units, or I don't know if there's a strong kind of speculative market, or whether the council or others need to kind of step in to kind of make some of these things start the ball rolling on some of these sites.
Thank you, sir. Just to, I guess, pick up in response to your question, some of the other points that were made as well. And I think the flexibility point is absolutely correct. You know, and I think Mr. Logan quite rightly pointed out, you know, it's very rare now for a business to be pigeonholed in a B1 or a B2 or B8. They often operate across all three, or even more use classes than that. And so certainly within our employment allocations in E1, we've tried to make sure that that flexibility across Class E and the B classes is there. Obviously, there are a number of other uses that generate employment, and I think the Nicholson Road application is a good example of how a site can look across the board. And just reading out the description of development outlined for a mixed-use community hub, business park, providing retail, restaurant, dwellings, GP surgery, leisure, business, and general industrial. So it's that kind of mixed-use site, albeit a large one, which is rare for the island, and obviously has challenges in terms of coming forward. It's certainly an approach that, from a plan making perspective, we would wholeheartedly support. I think moving on to the kind of stepping away from the larger sites and look at the micro issue that's raised by a couple of the respondents there. I think we have other policies in the plan that wholeheartedly support that approach. E2 and E4 being a couple of them, rural economy, and obviously our general policy supporting sustainable employment coming forward across a number of sectors. So, and I guess when you draw the parallel to housing, you know, that there is I guess there's a limit to how far you go down in terms of what you allocate, but then what's not allocated is, as long as it's supported by the other policies of the plan, then that doesn't stop that coming forward. And I think that's the approach we probably set out in terms of those micro employment uses coming forward. And just picking up on Mr. Gentleman's very good point around evidence and housing and employment, I think as I set out at the start, and I think you mentioned there is a kind of bottom-up approach, effectively our employment supply is effectively what's in the development pipeline, and we've taken the same approach in our housing. So when we move on to housing tomorrow, all those large sites with permission are in our housing supply, as are obviously the sites that are currently in the pipeline with applications in. So we've taken similar approaches in terms of what we've already got in the system and how we're looking to secure those through the plan. And I think, you know, the last point, again, going back to flexibility, absolutely key, and the policies there to support that, not just E1 but E2 as well. It's not specific around in E2 a particular type of use, it's just around employment and sustainable employment, and I think that's a key factor for us. And when we get into that decision making stage, obviously that's part of the process in terms of those applications coming forward and saying, well, what are they doing from an employment perspective, even if it's not Class E, Class B2, it's this, and it's going to generate this number of jobs, and that E2 would allow us then to look at that and say, yes, there's an employment generation from that site.
I should be able to recall, so apologies about this, but I mean, ordinarily employment land studies, thinking back to what's in planning practice guidance, tend to kind of, you know, do a bit of kind of market testing or speak to the local market to kind of help inform the kind of findings, a bit of a sort of a sense check. That happened for the Isle of Wight employment land study.
Yes, it did. So both in the 2022 version and also the previous one in 2018, there was elements of market research and correspondence with the market that took place. find the references in the study, and certainly can pass those forward.
You look at section 4 of EC1, that's the employment land study, the property market review. And as you work through that, you see that not only was there quantitative analysis, there was also qualitative analysis, which draws on, it tells us at paragraph 4.4, engagement with local property agents, Gully Howard Commercial and BCM, as it happens, as well as with key employers and the council's economic development team. So it wasn't purely, as it were, an external study based on quantitative analysis. It did involve engagement with relevant parties. And so just on the point about bottom up as opposed to other ways of dealing with matters, it's certainly right that the specific sites were primarily those which came forward through the market. You've been told Nicholson Road is actually council-owned land, but nonetheless promoted and available for development. But the ICNI study then doesn't, in a sense, just say, well, there they are. It does two things. One, it provides a numerical analysis of needs and demands to relate those to those sites. And then secondly, it carries out a review of the suitability of those sites. I know we'll talk slightly later about the Lowtherville site, because you've obviously asked a specific question about that. But with that site, as it were, in a slightly different category, the employment land study endorses the choices of the sites that the market had itself previously come forward with.
Thank you for those references. I'll go back and double check those. We're obviously under matter 8 shortly going to come on some of the specific sites. I try not to do this too often, but I didn't have a specific question about EA2 Nicholson Road, because in essence there's very little kind of representation on, if at all, on this site. Maybe a reflection of it. It's been a long-standing and kind of accepted kind of location. Just coming back to some of the points that were raised earlier. So it's a council-owned site. Obviously, it's the single largest site. Council doesn't have to answer now. It can maybe want to go and reflect on this. But I mean, in terms of, there's obviously a planning permission on the site. No. Yeah, brilliant. I think where I'm going with this is just kind of the assurance that this seems like such a large kind of strategic site in the employment kind of portfolio of this plan, and coming back to some of the themes from previous discussions about will sites come forward and deliver, whether given some of the things that have been raised, whether the council can provide assurances about what its intentions are in relation to Nicholson Road.
Certainly, sir, and I can do that. I'm sorry, I'm not at the main table or in name tag, but my name's Ollie Bolton. I'm Strategic Manager for Planning and Infrastructure Delivery for the council. And only last week, I was having conversations with colleagues around Nicholson Road and how to look to bring it forward as soon as we possibly can. So I think there's a couple of bits that are needed to be aware of as part of the backstory for this site. One is that it was very actively pursued by the council's regeneration directorate for a number of years, which brought forward, I think we David said 2019 there was an application, and there was a resolution to grant planning. Well, there were two applications, a full application for effectively phase 1 and an accompanying outline for the rest of the site. They both have resolution to grant from planning committee, subject to the signing of the planning obligation. That is currently out for signature. So we are working through there. We are working through understanding the highways and infrastructure implications of bringing the site forward, because as you may be aware from the other material in front of you, that there's quite a lot either proposed or consented within the Ryde northeast area. So we're looking at trying to coordinate the infrastructure as best we can. The council will look to bring forward its sites where it can. And has a record of doing so, thinking sites such as Branston Farm for a mixed use residential and smaller scale employment site, but they are highly dependent on the council being able to access funding and to get the finances in place to stack up to deliver those. And that is the final part of the jigsaw that is being worked through with colleagues to understand what the best route to market for future use of Nicholson Road site will be, either whether that's the council bring it forward itself or simply granting consent and then selling. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bolter. Got no further questions in relation to my agenda for this part of matter 2 and employment. Before we move off and come on to other things, Mr. Long.
So I just want to provide a point of clarification against the interface between matter 2 and matter 8, if that's okay. Is the intention with matter 8 to drill into the detailed policy requirements of the e-policies rather than matter 2?
So yeah, so sorry, yes, matter 8 will come into sort of the more detailed policy framework for employments. So yeah, we'll come on to that next. Okay. So anything further council wishes to say in relation to the employment land requirements over the plan period? Okay. Thank you for that. Indicated earlier, I think I'm going to leave matter 2 issue 5 in relation to gypsy and traveller accommodation needs. I don't think anybody's here for that particular session, so it could be something, a discussion we just had with the council. So I'm now going to move into matter 8. There are other people I think going to join us for this session. So what I'm going to propose is we have a quick sort of 5-minute break whilst we change from matter 2 to matter 8. So it's just gone 2:45. If we can be back here just after 10 to 3, and we'll resume the discussion on matter 8 for the final part of today. Thank you. Okay, it's coming up to 5 to 3, so I'm going to start and resume these hearing sessions. Everybody's hopefully now sitting around the table for matter 8, where we're looking at specific employment sites and policies. I appreciate there was a slight overlap and we had a small diversion into the Nicholson Road site, so thank you for the council for the information on that. So for this matter 8, we're going to first look at the employment sites that are identified in the plan, then look at a number of the employment policies, which will touch upon tourism and retail as well. Obviously, most people around the table obviously contributed and participated, so I'm going to dispense with a formal introduction to this particular session, but I would just obviously like to welcome Penelope Baker to this session, who's also made representations on the plan. I think you observed or were here in the room, Ms Baker, when we were talking about the previous issue. So, I mean, these are intended to be hopefully reasonably informal. I will ensure that everyone has an opportunity to speak and to say. Obviously, I've got representations and statements you've made in relation to the site which is of concern to you. So I'll bring you in at that relevant part of the discussion. So if I can turn first then in terms of matter 8 and the first issue, I've called them the proposed allocations, but I think speaking to Mr Brewer earlier, I'll call them proposed employment sites. Touched upon some of them briefly, but in terms of the site selection process, I think again, either Mr Brewer or Mr Bedford reminded me that obviously the employment land study has looked at these sites in terms of their attractiveness and suitability for employment provision. Obviously, there's a corresponding, as we discussed this morning, sustainability appraisal process that's looking more widely in terms of their suitability, etc. I kind of described it as bottom up. That might not be a wholly accurate or fair kind of description, but Mr Brewer, from the council's perspective, are these the kind of the reasonable suite or array of kind of employment sites for the plan to be promoting into as part of an appropriate strategy, and in terms of how you went about identifying those particular sites compared to any other options you may have had as part of plan making?
Thank you, sir. And yeah, I guess you've touched on a couple of the pieces of work that would have considered those topics, one of which is obviously the sustainability appraisal, and obviously the spatial strategy for the growth that underpins the policies in the plan as well. So, you know, again, the spatial strategy of the plan seeks to focus that plan growth in and around the primary and secondary settlements and the rural service centres, and all of the proposed employment allocations are in those locations. So they're not constrained to one particular location, they are spread out across those settlements, and obviously that process and that kind of spatial strategy was part of that sustainability appraisal process. I think we touched on already in terms of the bottom up and the kind of the pipeline and what's come through, you know, to us from the market effectively. And also notably a couple of these sites that have previously been allocated in the core strategy for employment as well. So again, it's kind of picking up things that potentially haven't come forward and are now in the pipeline as well. So it was a combination of factors really. And then again, I think just reiterating the point I made earlier around some of the smaller sites and how I guess the plan doesn't go into that level of allocation, but there are policies in the plan that would support and wholeheartedly support those types of development coming forward, and not just within the settlement boundaries. We've also got policies to look at some of those coming forward outside within the rural economy policies, which I'm sure we'll touch on later. So I think that's a kind of summary of kind of where we are and how we've got to the kind of employment allocations.
Obviously, our task is to look at what's in the plan, and what's in the plan is sound. We're not concerned with emission sites, but we obviously looking at these 6 specific sites as part of the previous discussion and this discussion, I mean, was the council presented with potential alternatives that you've had to kind of look at and appraise as part of the plan making process?
I wouldn't say we were blessed with alternative employment sites being promoted through the plan making process. There were some, but again, we looked at the kind of spatial strategy and the approach we were taking elsewhere within the plan and looked to make sure that the allocations align with those. So I think it's a slightly different conversation than we'll probably have tomorrow when we're talking about housing. But whilst there were some, they didn't necessarily fit the spatial strategy that we were trying to take forward in the plan. That's notwithstanding that potential other policies such as E4 could see some of those sites still come forward.
And then in terms of the specific sites that are then identified in policy E1, and apologies for the slight overlapping, kind of having a deviation to the Nicholson Road side. I think that was just helpful for our sort of understanding to some of the background. But in terms of the soundness representations that are before us, I can start first with site EA3. This is the Somerton Farm site in Cowes. Obviously, that site is relatively close to the BAE radar site. Obviously, you receive plan process, received regulation 19 reps from BAE concerned about whether that would affect their ability to do whatever they do at that site. From the council's perspective, I guess it's kind of your response to those concerns, and from reading your response to our question 8 point, I think it's our 8.3, whether as part of the current is a current planning application process, whether there's something here that points to possible modifications to EA3 or not necessarily at this stage. Mr. Brewer.
Thank you, sir. And I think probably just to bring you up to speed on that evolving situation, I'll call it that. So you're correct, we had some reps on the plan in relation to EA3. We're in correspondence with the agents on behalf of BAE. They have recently, just early this week, suggested a potential condition that could be applied to that permission, which would effectively protect the operations at BAE. And our initial view is that wouldn't necessarily be a constraint that couldn't be accommodated by development on that site. So we're just working through that with the consultant as part of the application process at the moment. And it may well be that if we get clarity on that and that condition gets confirmed, it could well be then that follows through into a modification to EA3.
The action list, can we request that the council keeps us appraised if there is an agreed condition that potentially can then be reflected or embodied within the requirements for site EA3? Should there be a subsequent planning application, whatever reason? Thank you. I had no further questions on EA3. I can move to EA5, which is the Lowtherville site at Ventnor. I mean, this obviously is a relatively modest site, but it is one that the employment land study sort of suggested or recommended didn't need to be retained. Is the council justified in retaining it? And there's a reference in response to our MIQ 8.1, Mr. Brewer, about part of the rationale for retaining it is the opportunity to secure funding. I don't know if you're able to expand or assist us on that point.
So yeah, this is a relatively smaller site, which is currently hosts some employment uses and some vacant land. And yeah, the employment land study recommends that it wouldn't necessarily need to be retained as an allocation, it would still be an employment site. So there is a policy in the plan that could take it forward. However, our view is that it remains justified to include it in allocation. There has been a history on this site of trying to secure funding to try and take a scheme forward, originally a mixed-use scheme, and then that didn't work out. So looking at potential live-work units, that again has not taken forward. So in our view, retaining it as an allocation from previous iterations of the plan is justified to potentially help with the securing of that funding, albeit it is a relatively small site. But sorry, I was going to say, but it is in obviously a location of the island where there isn't necessarily a high degree of growth that's going to come forward. But obviously that's reflective of the size of the site that we've got there.
Are you able to advise me, Mr. Brewer, is that a council-owned site? So
Yes, it
seeking
is.
funding to kind of help council deliver something. Yeah. Thank you. I wasn't going to raise anything further in relation to EA5. So we then come on to site EA6, which I'll kind of refer to as the Sandown Airport site. I mean, just to let people know, we've visited this site, this location, so we have seen it. We've seen its kind of relationship to the existing airport, and the other employment in the areas at the Lake Industrial Estate. And in terms, obviously, it's a part of a wider parcel of land, roughly to the southwest of the airport. Mr. Salmon has already referred to its very recent planning history in terms of a recent kind of refusal. I mean, from the evidence returned to the council from Mr. Brewer again to assist on this point in terms of the evidence we should draw on from either the employment land study or the sustainability appraisal, that this is an appropriate site for a mix of office and industrial uses, and is part of the rationale of this site to kind of support activity at the airport, or does it kind of stand alone as a kind of just part of the employment land kind of portfolio?
I think it can do. It's not necessarily just going to do that. And I think certainly the application, which I'm sure Mr. Salmon will reference shortly, was looking at providing some support for that. But in our views, and it's backed up by the evidence in the employment land study, is a site that's worthy of retention for allocation. It's providing a flexible potential employment site in the Bay Area, again of a particularly decent size in terms of some of the buildings that could come forward on it. And I'm sure we'll have a conversation shortly on the where we've been in terms of the planning journey on that one.
As indicated a moment ago, I mean, it's part of a wider parcel. And does the site allocation reflect what's been put forward with an emphasis on however the boundary treatment is going to be, if I can call it on the kind of the northern side, or just, it's obviously, I think, yeah, just understanding it's obviously part of a much larger parcel of land.
I'm sure Mr. Salmon will come in and have that, but there was a previous application for a larger partial area of land, which I think was quite a while back, I think. And obviously the more recent application was a more condensed area of land, which is reflective of the allocation. So I think, and again, the allocation itself, and I guess this is a consistent point to make, for all of the allocations in there, are each of the allocations has a series of requirements set out in policy that should meet. So in terms of the plan making process stage that we're at, we're flagging the issues that development on those sites should cover, and that's effectively as far as the plan making process goes on these, and then obviously the application process will pick up after that.
So it reflects, sorry to kind of labour the point, it reflects what was put to the council to consider as part of either a call for sites, or from your kind of understanding of.
Yes, my understanding, yes.
Mr. Salmon, is
Yeah,
Thank you, sir. I don't want to dwell on this and make this a planning appeal inquiry, but yeah, effectively the history of it, we had a larger scheme that was put forward as part of the first application that was refused or withdrawn. I can't remember, but we then revised the scheme and came back in with something that was reflective of the proposed allocation as it was at that time. And going through all the sort of lists of the requirements for the site, we quite arguably and positively tick those in a positive way. Unfortunately, there was a mismatch between aims and aspirations for the site and development management and the decision taken by planning committee. So we are extremely frustrated on that. In terms of this process, we wholeheartedly support the allocation. I have a client that owns the airport that wants to bring the site forward for investment and delivery of employment land, as well as part of a leisure scheme, which would be the relocation of the Sandown Airport Museum into that. So yeah, I come here to support the allocation, but I'm really frustrated in terms of the process and taking that forward to delivery. And as I've said previously, that reflects a lack of confidence in terms of the fruition of the plan and what do you want to deliver. I think the Isle of Wight generally undersells itself. I think there are maybe major opportunities here, but they don't deliver on it. And I think that's a real shame.
Thank you. But there are representations on the plan that raise concerns about this allocation. Ms. Baker, you're here today. You've so
Sorry, the last 5 years times have changed, haven't they? Let's be serious about it, and let's have a look at Sandown High Street and the serious situation it's in. As a resident, I have to say, I really wish there was more employment in Sandown High Street and more of a forward-looking situation than we have at the moment, which seems more about decline and no hope for the future. It's not helpful for the tourist economy. And with regards to the site on EA6, I have to say it doesn't appear that the local community has much to look forward to. It's a prospect of possible flooding as well as possible accidents, traffic jams, and no sustainable transport to get to that site, which is required 246 car parking spaces off a narrow part of the very important Newport Road. I mean, I know I've said all this in the statement, but things have changed, and we actually have, for employment, we have a very serious situation with the Vesta factory, which was mentioned earlier, and the Vesta factory will not stay in operation unless we have wind turbines with land allocated, and we don't have land allocated for those wind turbines on this spatial strategy. And I think that site on Sandown Airport, that is one of the most relevant areas where we could have renewable energy, which would support the existing industrial estate in South Lake. Thank you.
So, Ms. Baker, from your representations, and you've identified, as you say, some of the things you put in writing around highway safety, sustainable kind of transport and flood risk. In terms of the sustainable transport kind of links, this may be something we need to go back and look at more carefully. I mean, is there a bus route past past this site, like the bus
There is
stops?
the number 8, which serves, which is the only bus service which serves, as far as I'm aware, Benbridge and St Helens, that bit over there, as well as going, being the quickest route from, say, areas like Lake to Newport. So it's actually quite an important bus route. We actually have a bus stop on a grass verge right next to Honor and Jeffreys, which is an important local business, which stands to suffer if the employment site at EA6 goes ahead. And, you know, we're looking at possibly losing an important employer locally.
So I think if I can understand your position, Ms Baker, it's in terms of this plan, probably what you're asking us or inviting us to consider is to take this site out as an employment site.
And look at the possibilities of renewable energy there, which wouldn't interfere with the permeable surface. And obviously, with the new government and lifting the ban on wind turbines, there should be some investigation as to whether that site is appropriate. But we live in a changing time. We had a gale last night, so thank you.
Can just come back to the council. Obviously, we've got the employment land study evidence. Also look at the sustainability appraisal. In terms of connectivity of this site and serving, or prospective employees being able to get to this site. Told the number 8 bus goes along this road. Anybody able to advise us where would be the nearest kind of obvious bus stop or bus? Mr. Bolter's also keen to come in on this point as well.
I'm not sure keen is the right word, sir, but I might be able to assist. So I've just had a quick look at the information supporting the LPA's decision in relation to the planning application. So just to read from that, I would confirm that the site is over 800 metres from Newport Road. So that's the main road, and the accompanying bus stop. Scotchell's Brook Road is a private road with no pavements, and Embassy Way is a single track road with passing places and no pavements. Access for pedestrians is limited to walking on the road or the site of the road. There is a footpath route from Lake Common Road across the airfield, but this is in similar distance and includes pedestrian access along part of Embassy Way. So there are there is a level of connectivity for the site. Whether it's as good as it could be at the moment, I think that's in part why there were concerns in relation to the LPA's position and determination for the planning application. I note as well that in this instance, the application was deemed to be deficient in respect to traffic data attributed to the proposed use and the impact of Scotchell's Brook Lane and Newport Road. Whilst the increase in employment floor space is welcome in principle, the applicants have no control over the Scotchell's Brook Lane and cannot implement any improvements to the road junction, which Mr. Salmon referenced earlier, which includes the provision of a bus stop. So those were the concerns of the LPA on that point in relation to its determination to the planning application. I think there is a level of connectivity then between the development management decision taking and then also the plan making through the provisions proposed through EA6, which seek to ensure that those concerns are addressed in terms of any future submission on the site.
Thank you. I mean, as just having reminded myself of the policy EA6, so it obviously requires suitable access from the principal highway, improve pedestrian connectivity to the east. So just get my bearings. So that's towards Morrison's, the lake. Yeah. I mean, would it be necessary for soundness to have a specific requirement around public transport, infrastructure or connectivity, or would that be covered by other policies of the plan? Everything.
I think you could argue that it was covered by criterion A, you provide suitable access from the principal highway. It's a matter of fact that the bus route is on that principal highway. So if there is sufficient suitable access to that, then by definition, you've got access to that connectivity. So
the LPA as a decision-making body would be reading the development plan as a whole when arriving at decision.
So obviously, as you know, we'll deal with it in matter 9. The transport policies are applicable in that connection. So just also, in case it helps you on your recollections from your site visit and any further visit, I think in EC1, the employment land study on page 102, in those sheets at the back which go through the sites, there's a convenient aerial photograph of the allocated site. And I think if I'm reading the aerial photograph, which looks like it's either from Google or similar, there's a blue square on it, which is probably where the bus stop is. And you can also pick up on there on the opposite side of the road. I was going to say it's south, but it might not be. It might be west. Is the Honor and Jeffreys Garden Centre, which I think has just been referenced. Which I say it's on the opposite side of the road, so it's not part of the allocated site. So that might just help you in terms of your deliberations about that.
Thank you, Mr. Salmon.
Yeah, I don't want to dwell on it too much. I think one of the frustrations we had in terms of the planning application process was finding a solution to the bus stop issue. And we have a slightly unusual scenario here on the Isle of Wight where the development control function of the Highways Authority is with the PFI contractors, Island Roads, and they provide the advice to the Isle of Wight Council as planning authority in terms of what should be acceptable or otherwise. In all other terms, the thing was acceptable. We had extensive discussions in terms of where to put the bus stop. Clearly, the existing scheme needed to be improved. And they kept saying, no, that doesn't meet full standard, that doesn't meet full standard, whatever. From our side, it was quite clearly an opportunity for the planning authority to say, do you know what, actually the bigger gain here is jobs. We accept the improvement to the bus stop, albeit not full standard, and then get on with it. Unfortunately, the Isle of Wight Council's planning authority took the view, well, no, you can't overcome that, therefore it's a refusal of planning permission. So it leads us to conclude that the Isle of Wight Council speak with forked tongue to some degree. They want to promote the sites, but they won't grant planning permission for it, and they don't act proactively on it, certainly not in this case.
Thank you. Ms. Baker also referenced flood risk. Wasn't aware that this site is in an area of other than the lowest kind of flood risk, zone 1. Ms. Baker.
Well, Honor and Jeffreys on the other side of the road, like various properties, is at a lower ground level. So my argument is 2.9 hectares being turned into hard standing and various other whatever, is going to have an effect. And obviously water will seep down. And so it will affect that on the other side, which of course is also the vital Newport Road.
Thank you. Well, just to assure you, Ms Baker, we'll go back and revisit the area, look at the local highway and the issues that you've identified. Is there anything further you wanted to raise? And obviously we've got your statement, so thank you for your contributions. Just from the council's perspective in terms of drainage and other policies of the plan, obviously sustainable drainage systems are encouraged by the National Planning Policy Framework. Is that something you've reflected in environment policies?
Yes, absolutely. We've got a number of policies that cover off that issue, not least when it comes to design and also flood risk. And I think, as Mr. Porter said earlier, certainly from a plan making perspective, the policies of the plan all work together, and then that feeds into the decision making process, which is obviously separate to the process that we're going through at the moment for this particular site. But from a plan making perspective, the council's confident and comfortable that the allocation plus the other suite of the policies in the plan will be sufficient to pick up all of the issues that have been raised this afternoon. Certainly when it comes to some of those of a real site specific nature.
Thank you.
EV14, if you wanted to know.
Okay, then just finally on EA6, I note the council's proposing a modification in response to MIQ 8.4. This feels very much kind of factual rather than probably a matter of soundness. In the
Yeah,
description of the site needs updating.
it was just a factual, and I think it was just a kind of overhang from previous iterations. So.
Okay. And then just coming to a point we discussed previously in terms of kind of overall supply and sort of flexibility of employment provision. I think, Mr. Brewer, you've referred to this already. Obviously, there are a number of sites that are not in policy E1, but nonetheless are identified in the plan as providing a mix of uses of which employment would be a component element, including some of the key priority sites. I think the council's proposing a modification that policy E1 kind of highlights that fact that there's kind of more than just those 6 sites.
Yes, that's correct. And I guess it talks to the point we were talking earlier on, wasn't it, around that some of those housing allocations do have potential employment elements to them. So again, just reflecting them in that overarching employment policy to make sure we're identifying all of the supply that we're potentially going to get through the allocations in the plan. So that was again just a point of clarity really to provide certainty and make sure everything's talking to each other.
And is the intention on some of those sites, Mr. Brewer, that sort of employment or mixed use element, would that mitigate for any kind of potentially any existing uses that are on those sites, or is it genuinely kind of net new additional kind of floor space?
It's probably a bit of both, to be honest with you, in terms of the 3 that we've got there. So 2 of the sites do have some level of employment on at the moment, 1 doesn't. But obviously, depending on the nature of the schemes that come forward, it may seek to retain. Certainly, 1 of them does retain the current employment and add more on top of it.
Thank you. I'll move on to issue 2, which is now around the policy framework. I mean, for your benefit, Ms. Baker, I mean, we've discussed, it's probably as far as I'm going to, site EA6 today. So you're more than, if you want to leave at any point, we won't be offended if you've got other things you wanted to do, but you're more than welcome to stay and follow the discussion. Okay, that's fine. Yep, that's fine. Oh, okay. So issue 2 around the policy framework for supporting a diverse economy. Obviously, there are, in addition to the sites in East E1, existing employment sites across the island. And in terms of the plan's approach to kind of supporting those, and potentially protecting them, we asked through sort of our question 8.5, whether those kind of existing employment sites have been looked at as part of the employment land study in terms of ensuring that they still serve an employment potential or an employment use. Then in specifically whether the threshold of 0.1 hectares is justified in terms of that kind of level of kind of protection. Part D of the policy.
Yeah, and I think in the main, our responses as set out in our hearing statement to 8.5. And I guess, again, it talks to some of the conversations we had earlier around existing employment land. And that's an important part of supply. And obviously, if it's in current operation, then obviously it's performing a function and it's obviously working in terms of the market. And so making sure that type of land is protected is equally important as looking at additional supply on top of that as well. So hence why the policy is written as it is through E2. In terms of threshold, again, we've considered 0.1 as an appropriate threshold, thinking around the types and scales of employment sites that we've got, and we talked earlier on about that kind of micro point. And again, how far do you go down? So that isn't a particularly big threshold, but I think that's reflective of the island and some of the employment opportunities that we have already in place on the island. So I know other thresholds are higher in other areas and use different thresholds, but I think from an island perspective, certainly thinking the discussion we had this morning, that's quite important to make sure that we protect what we've got as well as look at additional lands.
Mr. Long, please.
Thank you, sir. I think what we need to be careful of is we don't rob Peter to pay Paul. So if you look at the narrative in below E2 on 8.42, it raises concern about the change of use into what I would consider other employment uses. So it basically says resistant to conversion of, for instance, retail, trade counters, etc. I'd personally put trade counter, they're the likes of your Howdens and your screw fixers and things which readily come under B8, but they are kind of trade counters. Where I look at it from a development control level, you know, we could spend endless days in an appeal talking about definitions and glossaries and what things mean. If I took that with a planning application head on and dealing with officers, they could readily say that actually, when you correlate that back to E1, where we've talked about the desired flexibility, and even section 8.4 talking about the agility of market changes, etc., we could run into quite big problems with 8.42 because it basically says the council don't want to lose employment units, basically the B2, B8 E uses, because they raise land values, increase pressure on speculative development away from employment hubs, etc. I just see there's a bit of conflict within that 8.42 that actually employment is a bigger subject than again what the E's and the B's are saying. Actually, our biggest employment uses over the last decade have been actually big retail. They have been, and they generate a lot. One of the biggest has been Asda, which was on the council's own land for employment purposes, etc. You know, they're generating 200-300 jobs. In the employment land study, I'll just bring it up. talked about, then they're basically the largest in this framework economic use was in it was the census which Mr. Bolter brought up, which generated is 1900 square meters at 200 to 300 jobs with 0 hours contract, and that was, it says, the island's largest within the last 20 years. We as an island, we need some variable, flexible space, and just concerned about that 8.42 and what that is readily going to apply when you get down to a granular planning application level. And just going on from that, there's probably we'll probably come on to it in a bit more detail in terms of E4, and equally what we call a rural industrial site, an employment site, what is small scale, what is sustainable rural tourism, what do these glossary of terms actually mean? I don't, getting into the, we spend weeks and months and sometimes years arguing about definitions, and what we're trying to do is have a clear route map for investment and productive growth. So one thing I'd advocate is the council could embellish on a glossary of what these terms mean, so it's absolutely clear for their own officers' sake and for ours, and it de-risks the investment profile about what people are looking at. I'm sure we'll come, I would like to address the rural economy in a bit more detail, but yeah, so that's kind of straight off path, but I think concluding the 8.42 just needs looking at a little bit in terms of its resistance and what type of uses, because that could actually underpin failure of E1.
Thank you. I'll come back to the council in terms of whether that part of E2 will be applied as potentially a prohibitive policy on areas of existing employment land, even if it means potentially going into other employment generating uses.
Thank you, sir, and thank you to Mr. Long for setting out that, and I think it's a really important point around that definitions and as you rightly say, to avoid long and drawn out conversations, and I won't say arguments, I'll say negotiations over what those terms can use. I think it's probably then worth reading on into paragraph 8.43, because that sets out when we are looking at those loss of employment sites, that the developers can have to demonstrate it's not going to be used for employment generating purposes. And I think that's the key, and possibly the point that Mr. Long's getting at, is that employment land, as I guess as we traditionally have always historically used in planning terms of B1, B2, B8, there are other employment lands available, if you get my point. So it's about that employment generating purpose, which I think is the key. So I think, again, when you look at the plan as a whole, you've got 8.42, and I accept the point around kind of definitions and glossary. We have to then read on to 8.43, which sets out and provides that employment generating purpose. So if a site existing employment use was being redeveloped for an employment generating purpose, then obviously that provides an opportunity for that site to go to that use because it's still generating employment.
Is there a, I mean, obviously the way the policy is worded is around the loss of employment land and uses will be resisted. It's kind of coming out to a relatively kind of negative sort of approach. I mean, an alternative is, loss of employment land and uses will only be permitted where there's a kind of a subject to the demonstration, and probably some of the things you referred to, Mr. Brewer, in 8.43.
It's certainly something we can consider and say if you'd like us to put some words together around potentially picking out a couple of supporting text points, putting it into policy to help provide that clarification around what happens in that event of employment land potentially going to a different use, then yeah, we can certainly happy to do that.
the intended consequences are likely to be. I think just concerned there could be a disconnect if you read some of the policy wording at particular, say, face value, and apply it in that way with perhaps seeing the bigger picture. Mr. Long.
I mean, just by way of illustration, I've got no objections to council's Nicholson Road, you know, make it happen. But if you look at its planning policy, the operative description, it is a mixed use, which includes residential, and it includes a doctor's surgery, it includes other things that wouldn't readily fit within this banner, and therefore the Nicholson Road would be a departure from E1 on that basis, which we all don't want. And we don't want to spend endless days arguing about definitions and glossaries if they're not spelt out, because it just takes endless, you know, these things get debated in the courts all the time, don't they, over such simple things when the intention and the vision, I think everyone's aligned with it. It just needs to be tightened up so that it removes its ambiguity. You know, is there a fundamental problem with retail being an employment use or a trade counter? Does it need to be that prescriptive? Because people will latch onto it. I don't think it needs to be. I think when we talk about employment more generally, it's about creating jobs within a very much wide variety of sectors. And that then underpins the flexibility E1 can take beyond the parameters of just the E's and the B uses.
Thank you. And we'll probably certainly reflect on this. I don't know, Mr. Brewer, to sort of wait for us to kind of come to a view on this, or I mean, yeah, but that probably might be the kind of preferred way rather than sort of potentially developing policy as we sit here now. But I mean, from the sort of the wider point that's being raised around whether there is a potential consistency point, or whether we need to kind of, whether some policies need to be kind of rephrased the other way into a more permissive kind of perspective. So where permission will be granted only where subject to.
Absolutely, I guess, you know, when we're looking at the, you know, the test for soundness and making sure the plan is positively prepared, then absolutely, just flipping that round is something that we absolutely can do. And again, I think making sure that there's sufficient clarity and less ambiguity is a benefit to all down the line. Obviously, we've got other policies that look at retail, and there's other tests you have to apply to retail development, which stand on their own 2 feet. So I think certainly there's some room for some additional clarity in that, but we're happy to perhaps wait and see if that's some wording you want us to come up with.
Okay, there's nothing further I want to raise on E2. I think the council has assisted on the point in terms of the distinction between E2, E and E5. Being used to the idea of tidal cut-off lines is a new thing. So I'm going to move on to policy E3, and this is the upskilling policy. MIQ 8.6. Obviously, the employment land study refers to skills level, type pay, seasonality, and I think we need to improve skills. See, policy E3 is in 2 parts, and the second part places a requirement on schemes of 25 dwellings or more to produce an employment and skills plan. Is the intention of this policy, Mr. Brewer, to kind of, I don't know, source materials, labour supply from the island? Is that the intention of the policy, or through development to invest in employment skills more generally?
I think it's more to reflect the fact that of developments of that scale have an opportunity to look across the board in terms of some of the skills and employment opportunities that they can offer through that development. So when you're thinking about apprenticeships and issues such as that. So, and again, I think the key word here is proportionate. You know, the ESPs, the employment skill plans, being required for that construction stage, proportionate to the scale of the development. And see the opportunities that scale of development can offer. But I think it's an important link to make. It's not uncommon in terms of the requirement for such plans to come forward in construction stage. Certainly in other authorities I've worked in, they've been relatively well managed and have actually been quite successful in terms of some of the opportunities they've created. So I think this policy was mainly around picking up some of those skills issues reflected in the employment land work and just making sure that they followed through, so that when development did come forward, it was of such a scale that some of those opportunities can be realised for the benefit of island residents.
And in terms of, we'll come on to viability next week, but does this have viability implications, and has that been considered and kind of factored in?
Yeah, so this was picked up, and as I say, we'll touch on that next week, but this was one of the things that was covered in the viability work and assessed, and it was demonstrated as having a low impact on viability. And again, some of it will be stuff that's already happening, and it will just be perhaps crystallising that and putting that in a form of words that allows some of those opportunities to be promoted.
Finally, on the matter 8 issue 2, this is in council's no, apologies, I'm taking things out of sequence. Come back to that later under issue 4, sorry. So moving on to matter 8, issue 3, the rural economy. I think here principally we're looking at policy E4 plan in terms of support for the rural economy. Just generally, Mr. Brewery obviously picked this up in our MIQ 8.9 and then further in 8.10 around the sort of the justification and the kind of the soundness of the overall approach in policy E4 and what the council's seeking to achieve through what's quite positively worded policy.
I'm going to pass over to Mr. Mills. I think you can give you a quick intro on this one. I'll pick up after that.
So it's acknowledgement that a lot of the island is rural in nature, and that's where a lot of the employment is, and it's giving a local interpretation of the NPPF paras 88 and 89. I know you've asked a question over the kind of disparity in the requirements in terms of the difference between bullet point C and then D and E. And we could make a change to make it more uniform in terms of putting the requirement on C. We were trying to reflect the fact that C is an existing, whereas D and E would be new. So in terms of understanding what the impacts might be, presumably they would already been identified and taken into account, albeit that the operation might change to some extent.
Thank you. I see Mr. Mills, the council's put forward a modification where we minded to seek some additional wording to policy E4 criterion C.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. But I note the distinction you're seeking to draw between C, D and E in terms of existing and new. I think that came out certainly from the regulator, a small number of regulation 19 representations. I think we're saying, why is the potentially the disparity between those criteria, and then if you potentially get an existing use that wants to either expand or intensify, are amenities and character going to be protected? And I suppose there's again the usual argument, if there are other policies of the plan that would come into effect, looking at the plan as a whole. I think from probably what the council's saying through the matter 8 statement, that's probably something you'd leave with us to see if we felt that modification was either necessary, whether it was needed for soundness, even if that change was to be made. In terms of more widely then policy E4 and the economy, I think Mr. Long, you indicated a moment ago this is an area of interest for you. From your perspective, is it kind of concern about whether the plan will be sufficiently proactive or supportive of proposals for the rural economy over the plan period?
Thank you, sir. I mean, on a general basis, I think E4, I actually think the major part of our Indigenous employment growth will be via E4 rather than E1, without a shadow of a doubt. As Mr. Mills alluded to, we have, our economy is pretty much rural, but the rural economy is the hardest one to tackle because it's where the least amount of growth is wanted. So actually, because it's the areas that we try to protect the most, but actually a lot of rural client base in terms of parts C and E are quite positively worded. However, I'll go a step further in terms of E4 Part E. I note that E4 is not a strategic policy, whereas strategically the rural economy on the Isle of Wight is of strategic importance. So should it be a strategic policy? The reason I say that is perhaps E4 Part E, small scale building or extension next to existing settlements or employment sites, is that of not strategic importance to then be placed in E2, which doesn't, E2's got more important, I would say more weight than E4, but E2 doesn't have the emphasis for new employment uses. It just relates to E1 on the employment allocations. Whereas if we want, as per the employment plan study, it encourages small business uses across the island. To have E4 not being a strategic policy or not using similar language in E2 just seems to be missing a trick there about a strategic level of gravity that we need for, to help the rural economy next to villages, next to smaller, in terms of the settlement hierarchy. Why can't we not celebrate E4 Part E for small scale employment growth as a strategic policy? Again, just a point slightly off topic, but on topic, in glossary, what is an existing settlement? Does that need to be related back to the settlement hierarchy? I know that was more related to kind of housing settlement hierarchy, but I think there should be some clarity in that regard. Next point was E4 Part F, sustainable rural tourism. I've been in a few appeals where we argue about what the word sustainable is, and 99.9% of the time it's about transport. Appreciate the sustainability is about environment and economy as well in equal balance, but I'd say the majority of appeals are about transport sustainability. So taking that on board, if you refer to NPPF about prosperous rural economy, it talks about sustainable rural tourism, so it uses the same language, but the narrative in E4 paras 8.54 doesn't talk about transport sustainability at all, which is actually, you could argue is quite a good thing, but just taking its reference from NPPF, I think it serves as an important point about clarifying what sustainability is in transport terms. In mid-paragraph of NPPF, says, and in locations that are not well served by public transport. That's still under the banner of supporting a prosperous rural economy. Again, it'd be handy, I think, for all parties involved that we don't get too, if that's the intention about sustainable rural tourism, we're not going to be het up on what drilling down into transport sustainability and the conflict that could arise with the MPPF. And that also mimics the language used in the specific tourism policy E8 that uses the same sustainable sustainable growth in tourism accommodation, but it doesn't really then drill down into what sustainable means, what you're scoping in or out. The last point is related to farm economy. So, of course, you know, in correlation with MPPF and the government's objectives to increase food production, you know, that's readily accepted. When you come on to diversification, always similar councils use similar language where diversification remains, where farming remains the principal land use, and got into many a debate with various rural authorities about what we mean by principal land use. Do they mean in terms of land mass, or do you mean in terms of the economic outputs? Both can be in conflict. Say, for example, many a farm, their land mass, the economy, the income that they're generating is partly from the farm, but majority through diverse income. That's how they survive, and that's going to be going, now the subsidies are going to be removed from government and going into something called ELMS and things like that. Diversification will become much more prevalent. What does principal land use mean? I don't know, and you could get into endless debate about what that means. And when we relate that back to, I think it's policy on page 55, policy EV8, protecting high quality agricultural land. We have an additional policy protection, understandably so, because that's in the MPPF and what it requires us to do. But there will be occasions where we are trying to diversify farms economy, debate about what principal land use is, and then we get to the debate about EV8 and agricultural land grade. Albeit there is a positive approach to EV8 in that it will allow development of something that's small scale. But what does small scale mean? Are we relating that back to minor or major applications in terms of thresholds, or are we open to take it as a proportionate approach depending on the application and the size of the holding? I don't know. On the one hand, flexibility of terms is quite good to debate, or the other way you go, quite prescriptive. I don't have a right or wrong answer, but just building in that there are some terminologies in there that you could spend a lot of time debating at planning application level, which isn't what anyone really wants.
One of the tests of soundness is, you know, policies have to be effective in terms of their implementation. I mean, the council's heard what Mr. Long's had to say in terms of whether policy E4 should be kind of strategic to kind of align with policy E2. And then we kind of get into some of the kind of the definitions of the kind of the various terms that are used there. I think sustainable is probably always going to be challenging because it does mean a number of things to different people, and it is just a term just kind of just regularly used in planning, whether there's any kind of clarity in the context of policy E4. But I don't know whether some of the other points that Mr. Long has raised in some of the definitions are sufficiently clear, or whether there's scope through glossary or supporting text. I mean, for example, where there's a reference to kind of existing settlement, presume my inclination would be that's a settlement within policy GS2, but as Mr. Long says, you could end up into all sorts of lengthy debates about, is that what it means? I don't know if the council, having heard what Mr. Long says, think there's anything there that needs to be picked up or responded to, or no, the policy is sufficiently clear and effective.
So if I just say, I think there is a box which immediately follows paragraph 3.4 of the plan on page 20, which seeks to set out how the council's gone about informing its strategic policy priorities. And effectively that has been used by the council to help it identify the distinction between strategic and non-strategic policies. And the specific issues in E4 don't easily sit in there as springing off one particular thing. I can see that, you know, with all of these things, there are shades of grey rather than it's an absolute black or white. But I think we would, I think, just exercise caution in the sense that if you look at any single policy and you, as it were, micro zoom in on that, you can sort of say, well, the issues there are very important to the island, it ought to be strategic, but you could probably then say that for every single policy. So I say that there's obviously an intention to have a distinction between strategic and non-strategic policies. We think we've got that distinction right, but we're probably not, as it were, died in a ditch, as it were, over that. And obviously it's open to other views. And I think we probably welcome your guidance. As to whether or not the glossary should be expanded, again, it's one of those things that I think we've got a glossary which seeks to explain, as it were, frequent terms, and therefore it's sufficient. But again, it's one where somebody might say, well, to be effective, this term really is crying out for explanation. I say we think we've got it right, but you know, we're not necessarily, I say, over precious.
Thank you. And I guess I'd just probably finish by almost reflecting something that Mr. Long said, in that, again, I'm probably err on the side of caution, because whilst I accept the point that defining every single term in a policy can provide clarity, it also reduces flexibility. And I think that's certainly from a perspective of some of the things we're talking about here and those micro rural economy opportunities. We're talking about diversification of farms, you know, small scale buildings on existing holdings. Actually, sometimes the ability to provide a flexible application approach to that can be beneficial. If you go too far in terms of definition, you then remove some of that flexibility, and we could end up having, whilst we wouldn't have an argument over the fact we haven't got a definition for principle, we might then be arguing we don't agree with the definition for principle and it should be this because of that. So I think we've tried to be as flexible as possible whilst picking out the key themes. And I think, yeah, we'd welcome a steer if there was any thought of additional terms that might need some definition.
And some things are inherently come down to planning judgment in terms of, you know, what's small scale or small scale. Sometimes those debates and arguments are unavoidable. I'm not saying that to drum up work for inspectors, but I mean, in all seriousness, I mean, I don't know about the issue of principal land use, whether that is something that does have is something that does need to be kind of bottomed out. That's the only one out of okay.
It's the one I don't noted down as well, is probably that could do with something. Mr. Long.
I mean, ultimately, do we need, I say we, do we need that part saying principal land use? The MPPA talks about diversification of the rural economy. That's the strategic approach of it. It doesn't bring into the factor of the principal land use. I just think it brings in an element of complexity, and there's no rationale within the subtext for it. Yeah.
Okay, noted. I don't know if the council has a view on what's been suggested there in terms of whether the second part B, that needs to be, that creates a sort of a soundness issue or needs to be removed in order to make the policy sound.
My initial reaction is that we'd want to retain that, and because without it, you potentially have an open-ended diversification of that farmland, and I think, as Mr. Long said, sometimes it's the diversified aspects of that holding which generate the income, and I guess there's a danger then you could potentially end up with trying to put it in percentage terms, 95% diverse uses and 5% farmland, and are you then moving away from actually a rural economy to something different? And obviously, I know there's other points in the policy that cover off some of that, but I think certainly from our perspective, in terms of what we're trying to do with this policy, I think we'd want that to remain in there, albeit potentially with a glossary definition.
I think clearly there is in terms of a land use issue, there is a well understood distinction between primary uses and ancillary uses, but that only works, supported by the case law. An ancillary use has to be functionally related to the primary use. Clearly, this isn't getting at that distinction, because the diversified use might well be functionally quite unrelated to the principal agricultural use. I mean, one could have, whether it's some kind of micro brewery or some kind of craft-based enterprise that happens within former farm buildings, etc., which may be very important from an income generating point of view to the farm business, but absolutely nothing to do with the functional relationship. So you couldn't use primary and ancillary, but there is clearly intended there to be a distinction between principal and subordinate, which is obviously really getting at a scale type issue. I mean, in putting it in lay terms, not wanting the diversified uses to be the tail wagging the dog, but still ensuring that the principal activity within that overall holding is one of agriculture rather than one of diversified, effectively, uses that could themselves be accommodated perfectly well within urban areas, because that's clearly not the purpose of having a rural economy and rural economy policies. So I think that's the issue for us, that we think that final part of the clause serves an important purpose. So we're open to any suggestions of how it could be improved to make it more meaningful. So the obvious one that occurs is primary ancillary, but that doesn't work for well understood reasons. So we find it difficult to think that there is actually a better word than the word that we've used.
Final point, Mr. Long, before I move on.
I just think there's, just in terms of farm economy, farms don't make any money. They do not. So the principal uses of that, these farms have to diversify, are, as per NPPF, talks about the sustainable growth and expansion of all types of business in rural area. They're not related to the farm per se, they're just related to natural commerce and industry that they think is good for that location, that will attract a market that's completely different to farming. It's not the micro brewery where they grow their hops. We've got clients all across the country that, they'll on the farm they've got McLaren F1, or they've got, but that enables the farm to be kept in business. We probably will watch Clarkson Farm and the economy that the farm generates versus what they're trying to do with other things within the industry. It's quite atypical of every farm on the Isle of Wight and also the UK. But, we have to let farms diversify whilst they'll die. They undoubtedly will die. And therefore, we need to be very careful with the principal land use. does it mean land, the actual land use mass, or is it the viability of the business? I just don't know what this means. If it's the viability of the business, then the policy's already defeated itself, because if you look at the council farm businesses, their income is not from farming.
Thank you. Is there anything further the council wants to add before I move off E4?
I may do later on if that's okay, so I'm just going back into historic reps from the NFU on this particular policy, which might help provide some further thoughts, but perhaps we'll come back to it if that's okay with you, sir.
Okay, I'm going to made a note of the various points that have been said. Obviously, reflect on that. And if there's anything further we need to follow up in the first instance with the council, we would do so. If it triggers any kind of main modification, then that would obviously be subject to consultation in due course. I want to move on, please, to the next item under matter 8, which I think is, just check the agenda. I think it's tourism. And in particular policies E8 and E9 in terms of supporting sustainable tourism development, in terms of the balance between, securing the economic benefits versus the inherent sort of qualities that attract visitors to the island. In terms of the obviously policy E8 seeks to support high quality tourism across the island. It makes a reference within the policy to core tourism accommodation areas that are shown on the policies map, which I think are effectively Shanklin and Sandown. Whether that's a justified and effective approach. And in terms of the policy, what will comprise the kind of the robust evidence that the council's seeking if you're a decision maker? What are you looking for?
Thank you, sir. And I think to start off with, the policy is trying to recognise that essential function that tourism plays to the island economy. We've talked about the rural economy just now, and the tourism economy obviously plays an essential part in terms of the island, both in terms of jobs, wider kind of spend, I guess, that the tourist market brings to the island. So I think the fundamental kind of supportive nature of the policy towards kind of viable high quality tourism is sound and is effective and is appropriate for the island as well. You're correct, the two core tourist accommodation areas, as we set out in our response to 8.16, I think it is, are two relatively constrained areas in Sandown and Shanklin, which have historically been those kind of tourist accommodation areas. We recognise that the tourist accommodation market has changed dramatically over time, and I think certainly those two places have seen the effects of that. And I guess we're used to have the everyone would go and stay in Sandown and Shanklin, and that's where we PGL school journey. I know I came down here on PGL about 30 years ago, I think, and stayed in a hotel in Sandown, but it's not quite the same now, and the ability for people to stay in other places through Airbnb, etc., has had an impact. But notwithstanding that, you know, tourism does still play a key role in those two particular settlements. And I think the policy approach we've taken here is a step on from where we are currently in terms of the level of protection provided through the core strategy. So we recognise that tourist accommodation in these areas, we'd want to protect it, but we also recognise that if it can be robustly evidenced and it's no longer viable, then alternative uses may be appropriate. And I think in terms of that robust evidence, again, we take quite a prescriptive approach in the current core strategy to that, and we've taken a less prescriptive approach to that in the supporting text of policy E8. And I think that again is reflective of the changing tourism market that we're experiencing, we've got on the island. So I think, say, our responses to 815 and 816 set out the core points, and happy to hear from others who I think may have some comments on this.
Thank you. So I think in terms of that part of the policy, in terms of whether, unless it can be robust, the evidence, I'm probably then looking at paragraph 899.
Yes, correct.
Doesn't kind of spell out exactly what's required. It's the council's inference that there's a degree of flexibility, or you don't have anything specific in mind in terms of what you're seeking. Is it sort of 12 months marketing, or is it
the current situation is that we are prescriptive through the core strategy, and obviously the approach we're putting forward here is less prescriptive than that. And I think some of the conversations we've just had this afternoon on flexibility are reflective of that approach that we're taking. We recognise that the tourism market is very dynamic, and it will continue to be so. And I think the traditional seaside towns, if you like, will probably continue to change in nature, and we've tried to put forward a policy approach that reflects that.
Thank you. If I can bring in Mr. Gentleman first, and then Mr. Long.
Thanks very much. This is a really difficult policy to get right, and I'm sure that you've driven through the hotel areas, and I'm sure you will have noticed that in Sandown, at least 50% of that is derelict and has been for decades. This policy has been in place in some shape or form for years, and it's failed consistently to preserve the hotels in this location. In fact, what it does is worse. It underpins the resistance of changing the use of buildings which are no longer fit for purpose. There's no money to convert them into another form of use. And it just holds them as a scar on the landscape because there's no economic exit for them without protracted, complex negotiations with clear routes for exit. I understand that there is more flexibility proposed in this policy than there has been historically. But historically, the resistance of losing these areas just has failed drastically. It's a massive letdown for Sandown and Shanklin, which are beautiful areas. When you stand on the beach there and you look out to sea, it really is wonderful. You turn around and you look to the shore, and frankly, it's embarrassing. Now, something else that's really notable about the Bay Area is geographically limited in its expansion. There's a head of population that I think around about 20,000 people in the Bay Area, something like that. The allocations in the Bay Area are about 190 dwellings for housing, which is obviously a very, very small percentage increase. The losing these tourism accommodations and allowing them to be converted to residential use, and I dare say that they would continue to be Airbnb or some kind of more appropriate use, would have the ability to expand housing within the Bay, which is needed and important. But most importantly, it would allow the Bay Area to change and move with the times. This is, even in the form still derived, a draconian policy that is holding back change, and it really is damaging to the island. Does need to be revisited completely. David Long has touched on negotiations and the difficulties when you've got to go and engage about what you're going to do. That's a blocker for something. Now, if this was to change, I'm not saying that the Bay Area would change overnight. It simply couldn't. And even if you were to do that, the rate of sale of these kind of developments, when you look at breakwaters, for instance, that's being developed on a former tourism site, is very slow. But we do need to make this change because what we've got here as a policy is not right.
And in terms of the change, Mr. Gentleman, are you saying remove this core tourism areas?
100%. This policy does not work. removal of the policy will allow the businesses that are flourishing in the area to continue. It won't cause them to leave, but better than that, it will improve everything around them, which will allow them to flourish. I think, James Brewer's alluded to, visiting the hotels of old in Sandown and Shanklin, and you look at a lot of the stock there, and it really hasn't changed. It hasn't moved with the times, and I'm sure a look around the room and suggestion of where you might look to go on holiday, and I dare say your first move would be to Airbnb or a holiday cottage or something similar. And that does roll nicely into the next policy, E9, which again, I'd like to raise some points on, but we can get to that appropriately. Thank you.
Mr. Long, please.
Thank you, sir. I completely agree. I mean, the restriction of hotel policy predates the unitary development plan, which was adopted in 1996, and that the process of protection has continued since, and it hasn't worked. It's not my particular area of experience in terms of professionality and conversion of, but I live in Bembridge near Sandown. I drive through it and my heart drops. To me, when you get into a planning application, granular level, you ask the planning officer, when's the last time you holidayed in a hotel? The answer is quite clear. We don't. And therefore, why are we trying to protect the stock that the nation doesn't holiday in? We also got to remember that if you remove a policy, doesn't mean Sandown is a great area, and by reduction of the stock, it will still give the ability for hotels to operate, but within a marketplace that is a lot smaller, which will bring up the quality. It also brings then the ability for residential development to occur via conversion or redevelopment. In consequence, that brings more footfall and spending power into the high street economy, and it's just got a positive gain to it. To me, this policy is just a failure for Sandown completely, and it has to be revisited. It's the strongest thing in the motive thing in me. This whole policy has to be sorted out, because we cannot continue with Sandown as it is, and we have to trust that the industry, the hotel industry, there'll still be hotels in Sandown, and the narrative that because it's near the sea is a prime location just because you're sea doesn't mean that your hotel will be a brilliant establishment just because you can see the sea. That's a testament of the decades of deterioration in the bay, and we're just going to keep on fueling that fire.
So Mr. Brewer outlined the council's putting to us that this is a more flexible or less prescriptive approach than the 2012 core strategy. Does that provide a more positive framework
No,
for these sites? No.
I think you just have to get rid of it.
Thank you. From the council's perspective, when you were sort of preparing the plan, I'm afraid we're coming back to the knotty issue of sustainability appraisal. Did you look at an option of having no core tourist accommodation areas, and what that could mean in terms of things like economic objectives or other objectives?
I believe we will have done back in probably the first essay in 2018. We'll have a look into that and just confirm that to you. And I hear all the points that are being made, and I guess one thing we can all agree on is that the tourism market is inherently different and will continue to potentially change. And obviously we've tried to reflect that in this, and I hear and acknowledge that the points have been made. And I suppose it's balance, isn't it? When you're looking at a plan, you're trying to balance something which is so important to the island in terms of that tourist economy. There is no doubt about that, and I don't think anyone will argue with that in the room, that the tourist economy is absolutely essential for the island. And so from a land use perspective, we're trying to make sure that there is still the opportunity for that tourist accommodation to come forward in what are, let's face it, two restricted areas. Albeit I acknowledge again that parts of those areas contains some derelict buildings, and obviously there's a whole myriad of reasons for why some of those sites are derelict and haven't come forward, and we could spend all afternoon talking about the different owners, etc., but we won't. So I think, you know, we'll sit back, you know, we'll happy to take a steer from the inspectors on this one. We have put forward what we think is a more flexible approach. We hear and acknowledge the points that are being made, but I think from our perspective, we're trying to provide that balance of land uses in the plan and also reflecting a part of the economy that is really important for the island.
If the steer from the inspectors was having sort of weighed up the evidence that we didn't feel that this designation was no longer justified, or it wasn't going to be particularly effective, and what councils say potentially could be the harm that could arise from that. I mean, if these areas being given, to use an inspector's phrase, a fair crack of the whip in terms of, you know, a chance to be used for some form of a tourist accommodation over a period of time, and is it still sort of justified to continue this policy approach in one form or another, even if it's less prescriptive? I want to understand the harm, and I want to, maybe the council can point as a specific evidence base we need to kind of.
So that's what I was going to suggest. You probably, if your mind is working in that sort of direction, to understand the harm, you would probably need, if we can provide the information, looking at the two areas, a reasonably up-to-date, effectively snapshot of the proportions of those areas which are in tourism accommodation uses at present, as opposed to vacant or derelict. Not simply in terms of land use, because obviously they will all have presumably a planning permission which requires, as it were, their lawful use will be as tourism accommodation, but there will be some which you might be able to easily identify as inactive tourism accommodation. There will be others which are, I say, either vacant, unoccupied, derelict, or whatever. But in terms of, as it were, gauging what would be the harm of a change of policy approach, I think you probably need to understand, in a sense, what is the resource that's there at the moment that is potentially at risk of, I say, the council's approach is to allow for move away if there's a justification. I think those representatives in the room is move away regardless of whether there's a justification, which potentially could see the ousting of viable tourist uses from those areas because there is a higher value use which could supplant it. So that's the issue of gauging the harm, and say how serious a problem that is. You probably will be better informed by a bit more of a snapshot of what is there.
And can council advise me, is this a policy area or area of protection that can be traced back to the unitary development plan?
Good question.
We can look quite easily.
We'll have a look. And can I just ask one point of clarity, if that's right, please? And I think it in partly to some of the comments we've heard, and we've heard a lot about the policy, but as far as I understand it from the representatives, and potentially this might assist in terms of the future thinking, are we just talking about the second to last paragraph of the policy rather than the whole policy in itself? So obviously E8 and the list of that supporting sustainable growth in high quality tourism obviously talks to lots of different types of tourism, not just accommodation. And then that paragraph at the end is around protection of in the core tourist accommodation areas. So again, it would assist us, I guess, in terms of perhaps that potential work we do, just to get clarity over whether people are expecting the whole policy to disappear or just the protection within the tourist accommodation areas. That would certainly help myself anyway.
I'll turn to Mr. Gentleman and Mr. Long without prejudicing their answers, but from reading the representations, my understanding it was this is the nub of the kind of the soundness issue, is this core tourist accommodation areas. rather than the wider policy per se. But having
I think the,
that's my interpretation. You can now tell me I'm
so yeah,
completely wrong.
to my mind, it's the map that ring fences these specific properties as that core policy. And to be clear here, you know, removing that does not remove the uses that are successful and operating as viable businesses. That just won't happen. Now, I'm a residential property developer. I've been on the island developing for over 20 years. I've developed everything from blocks of flats in seafront locations to housing estates of 80 houses. The viability, the financial viability of turning all of that sea frontage into flatted development is extremely challenging. The rate of sale of those type of that type of flatted accommodation, which would typify what you would replace that with, is very slow. Therefore, the finance costs are high. That erodes the profit. The values there are not typically high. So just removing that policy is not the silver bullet. And it isn't the silver bullet in terms of just converting that to residential accommodation. That's not going to create a loss of that tourism element and that use. And it's not going to be a change that occurs overnight. But what I can say is that retaining this ring fence around those properties and resisting change to anything but has not worked. It does date back to the UDP and possibly earlier, but certainly it was in the UDP because I remember working that document. Yeah, it hasn't worked. Thanks, guys.
And just I mean, just for example, one of the kind of limited success stories for Sandown has been what Mr. Gentleman referred to, breakwaters, which is in the council's land supply it's called Wight Leisure, I believe. And it's been, you know, fairly big building, but actually it creates some form of iconic style of residential structure that's going to, and that's, you know, it's created an enlivened a sea frontage that could be kind of flowed along the sea frontage. The next one was Premier Inn took a commercial decision to build a brand new Premier Inn on the seafront, not because they were told to by policy, but because they took a commercial decision that, you know, when we're searching for, it's not, Premier isn't per se a holiday hotel, it's a business commuter, you know, short stay hotel, which is how we all probably operate within our hotel stock. Taking that on board, it's not just because the policy is going to go, doesn't mean Premier Inn are going to go, hey, bingo, we're going to turn these all into residential, because their business portfolio is tourism accommodation, irrespective of policy requirement. So we shouldn't be frightened about the market taking in a hotel opportunity. The prime location might attract hotels just by virtue of the whole area being upgraded quite slowly and take probably a few decades to do, but then you will get the posh hoteliers to come in to then go to your part E8B niche tourism products. This is what we're aspiring to do, but you need to trust the economy that that's going to take place. And in the meantime, where we all want to holiday is not in hotels, it's within your more unique, it could be on sea frontage, but it's in different areas now. We've gone beyond that post-war seaside nostalgic holiday trade, which is what this policy is still trying to protect.
You. So I think to answer your point, Mr. Brewer, in terms of sort of clarity of kind of which part of E8 may require some further focus, I think it really is that paragraph. Just reminding myself what the councillor said in response to MIQ 8.16. You obviously refer us to on page 19 of your hearing statement, supporting evidence, which includes a number of documents, corporate plan, regeneration strategy, island investment plan, and some other documents as well, the corporate policy context explainer. Obviously, we'll relook at that in light of the discussion we've had, but if we were of a view to seek some further information for a relatively brief, concise paper that kind of pointed to some of the evidence that Mr. Bedford was referring to in terms of proportions of uses that are either in tourist use or currently vacant, whether you can point us to what you did look at. I appreciate we've now got the previous sustainability appraisal reports, but what you kind of looked at, potentially whether a policy, alternative policies, including effectively a no policy, how that performed in terms of sustainability appraisal, would be helpful, together with confirmation whether this is something that's going back as far as the unitary development plan. And then we'll come to a view and make a steer on whether we think this should remain part of the plan.
Absolutely, yeah, we're more than happy to put that short paper together. And just for clarification, policy T4 in the UDP did designate hotel areas, and they covered the same general locations as we've got in core tourist accommodation areas.
I won't set it out now, but we'll perhaps put some further sort of parameters on what that evidence is and the time frame for the council to produce it. Is there anything further on policy E8 before I move on to policy E9? No, in which case policy E9, approach to short-term let holiday accommodation. Obviously, we've got document EC3 to the examination, which is kind of explainer, helpful explainer to this policy. I think we presented in our MIQ 817 the concerns that were raised as part of the Regulation 19 exercise around the justification and effectiveness of the policy. And I think probably in fairness, the council's paper in EC3, I think recognises some of the issues around this kind of policy approach. From the council's perspective, is this an island-wide issue? Are there particular hotspots or particular issues that you're seeking to manage through this particular policy?
I wouldn't necessarily say there are hotspots. I mean, there are areas obviously where there are high proportions of short-term let holiday accommodation, and it'd be no surprise that those are in either potentially locations close to the sea or in some of the more rural areas of the island, rather than the kind of town centre and main settlements. I think, yeah, the document EC3 sets out, I guess, in some ways, the journey this policy's been on, whilst there have been parallel government consultations on this particular issue, and it is something that's quite challenging to try and write policy to cover, because there is an issue, and there is no doubt about that, and I'm sure everyone in the room will recognise that, you know, as we've talked about today, the changing nature of the tourism market has meant that there has been a loss of housing stock in some locations that has gone to short-term holiday accommodation. And obviously we can talk about the benefits and disbenefits of that to those particular areas. And I think that the challenge we have, and we still have at the moment, is that we don't have that national change of use. So we're still in the arena effectively where there is no different use for short-term let holiday accommodation. It's still class C3 unless there's material change and it's gone to sui gen, which is obviously where the policy is at the moment. Obviously, the government had launched a consultation on that issue in June 2022. That was on the basis of the sector itself saying we really need to have registers of short-term lets of different use class, make people apply for planning permission to go through that. So the issue is there. I guess we're in that slightly grey area at the moment where the national legislation doesn't define anything, but we're trying to address the issue through policy. So obviously reflective of the conversation we've just had on core tourist accommodation areas, which is where this policy links into. The purpose was effectively to try within those areas to make sure that we wouldn't have changes of use away from that in those areas. But again, happy to take views and comments and respond accordingly.
So the policy is not limited, even that second sentence, to the tourism accommodation areas. It does allow the approach to also apply if such areas are identified in neighbourhood plans or outside of those areas where the criteria is met of no adverse impact on residential property.
Bring in others. So I think Mr. Gentleman, I think you indicated a moment ago, this is again another policy area you have concern with.
Thank you. Yeah, this is quite a hot potato, becoming so in the press, and there's some interesting parallels. So within this, we've got reference at 8.10 about regulatory taxation changes within the private rental sector over the past 12 months. Obviously, that's quite an old sentence, but we've seen wholesale change within the private rental sector as a result of taxation changes, in effect penalising private landlords. We now face a rental crisis across the Isle of Wight, as we do across the UK. The difference on the Isle of Wight is that we can't attract, through viability reasons, the large-scale build-to-rent schemes that are underpinning things on the Northern Island. What we've got now is we've also got regulatory change occurring in holiday lets. We've got a taxation change in April this year, which have a big effect on how those work. There are also, and we'll have to see how that washes out for tourism accommodation. But we've just discussed the historic importance of trying to keep tourism areas. Now we're looking to try and preclude tourism accommodation on an island that is underpinned by our tourism economy. There's a bit of madness there, really, isn't there, in terms of how that correlates. I think really it comes down to some fundamental issues. If we don't have enough private rental accommodation and we try and make changes to free up those houses for the market, and now we're saying we don't have enough housing stock, so we're trying to prevent holiday lets to free up houses for the market. Surely the same thing occurs in both arguments. Build more houses, and then you solve that problem, rather than looking at trying to tackle and limit tourism holiday cottages on the Isle of Wight in a tourism area. There's some dangerous issues potentially that can occur from planning changes to holiday accommodation. I have some holiday accommodation as part of my investment portfolio, and that's financed by holiday let mortgages. Now, it's yet to see how the market will react to holiday let mortgages and what changes that will bring about. Now, beyond personal effect from that, that will have an effect within the marketplace. In my opinion, we need to stop meddling with the markets as far as these things go. The changes that have been brought about and referred to here about buy-to-let have caused a crisis within the rental sector, and there are unintended consequences of well-meaning policies. And here we have some well-meaning policies in the way that they're written, and I get the impetus behind them, but there will be unintended consequences from this. And tourism, as we've discussed, is vital to our economy. And I think there really needs to be very, very careful consideration of the implication of the policies here as they're written.
Mr. Long.
Thank you, sir. And just within the context of kind of the loss of permanent housing stock, it's very rare that, say, a new housing development, just by virtue of its location, will be suitable for holiday accommodation, just by virtue of its location and its nature on an estate. The holiday accommodation on the island is prime by virtue of its uniqueness. You know, you go onto Airbnb and how you search a property, we all ask us, when would we have last stayed in Guildford on a David Wilson estate? We don't, because that's not where we holiday as a nation. And so is the root cause of trying to create this policy, what is its purpose? Yeah, its purpose is to protect permanent housing stock, but actually the island does have a saturation point in the availability of what I would call quality Airbnb style properties. It's not going to massively increase because we compete within a UK and worldwide marketplace. you're not going to radically increase the levels of supply stroke demand just because of this policy introduction. And so the saturation point's probably at its saturation point. So what is this trying to achieve? If it's trying to achieve something that's protecting new houses being built for holiday purposes, I just don't think there's that correlation. And Justin's, as alluded to, has built quite a few housing developments of different scales. And I would readily bet none of those have been sold to a holiday home purchase, so for short-term holiday let purposes. The other thing, just borrowing that kind of principal concern, was probably some clarity that if this policy was to stay in soundness and to carry forward, does E9 then still have the same levels of policy protection that E8 has? I.e., if someone did go into a short-term holiday let and had the proverbial change of use, does that then trigger the policy protections in E8? Because then we'll get into dangerous territory. Because if we subsequently want kind of those flexible mixed uses within the C3 use class category, and we want housing, then it seems like, again, we're robbing Peter to pay Paul for then someone to convert into a short-term holiday let back into a house, which is what the policy is trying to protect.
Gentleman again, and then I'll come back to the council.
David got the last point, which was about the ease of then converting something back. I just think it's counterintuitive. Thanks.
Thank you. To return to the council then, in terms of issues that have been raised in relation to, I think, really the kind of the implementation of this policy. Presumably on the one hand, are there going to be some sort of challenges in terms of how will you know some of these proposals are coming forward? Are you relying on kind of enforcement to tell you, and retrospectively?
And I think that was one of the issues we picked out in our supporting evidence paper on this particular topic in I think it's EC3, I think, is that particular point. And I guess that goes to the nub of the policy really, and where we don't have that separate use class for short-term holiday accommodation, and we're still having to make that judgment as whether it's gone to sui generis, and we've set out some of the factors that we would consider in making that judgment. Then yes, we are to a certain extent reliant on those being reported to us, or obviously people doing the right thing and putting the applications in. So that's how we would then effectively implement the policy in those situations.
I mean, is it potentially that the policy is potentially premature, and then if there was further action on, you know, as you say, the government's consulted on various kind of possible changes to the use classes order, if there was more certainty around that as part of a plan review, at the time of plan review, given what we started from this morning in terms of this authority potentially being in an area of sort of imminent kind of plan review, if there was more certainty at that stage to look at a policy.
I'm certainly not going to disagree with the fact that more certainty on a national level would assist not only the implementation of this policy, but on this issue altogether. And I guess where we started this from the sector back in 2021 and Airbnb putting that report together, that journey is still continuing. So I'm not going to disagree with that point at all.
But I think it is fair to say that on the, as it were, the framework, I'm not using that to mean the MPPF, but the planning framework that we have at the moment, it is recognised that some changes of use within, as it were, the overall residential concept will be material changes of use away from a C3 dwelling use to a sui generis use. Where those changes of use happen, they are development and therefore will require planning permission. All that this policy seeks to do is to say that in circumstances where you require a planning permission for such a change of use, these are the criteria by which we will judge that application. Partly it's spatial or locational, which is the tourism accommodation, and if it's in a neighbourhood plan, and partly it's impact based, i.e. where there's effects on residential amenities. So I don't think that as a matter of principle, you could say that having a policy to deal with it is premature in the sense that it's relying on, as it were, a future change of policy or legislation, because it isn't. It's capable of working under the framework that we currently have. As to its effectiveness, obviously you raised the issue of, well, is it reliant on this where people reporting? Well, that will be no doubt one way in which things come to light. There will also be people who do make applications. There will also be people who make applications for certificates of lawfulness to clarify the status of uses. So I think what one really just has to ask in judging this policy is whether it is proportionate as a means of dealing with a particular issue. Obviously, we set out in EC3 as it were, the genesis of why there is an issue in some localities. We've referred also to that in the paragraphs of the supporting text. We don't think that the policy is actually unduly onerous, because it isn't saying there are no circumstances in which these will be approved. It's saying that there are circumstances where they will be supported, and it sets out the criteria that allows that to be judged. So as I say, we think it's proportionate, but obviously ultimately you're going to be the arbiters of that.
And in terms of the point that was made in terms of if this policy remains in some way, shape or form within the plan, proposals are determined for short-term holiday accommodation, are they then subsequently drawn into the realms of policy E8?
Depends where they are, I think, is the answer, because E8 is obviously geographically confined so far as that particular criterion is concerned only to the tourism accommodation areas, whereas E9, as I think I was indicating, actually has a wider compass, because it's not limited to only applying to tourism accommodation areas. So, for example, if somebody outside of the tourism accommodation area sought planning permission to change the use of a C3 dwelling house to term let, holiday let, and that was granted planning permission, that would not itself bring that location within the remit of E8, because it would be outside of a tourism accommodation area. And it would then be a question of the conditions of the relevant planning permission as to what restrictions might then apply in relation to any subsequent uses.
So if something was granted under policy E9
Yes.
for short-term holiday, it wouldn't be subject to a kind of restrictive accommodation.
Well, it would if it was in a tourism accommodation area. If you had a premises that currently was in the tourism accommodation area, but which was not currently in tourism accommodation use, and they sought under policy E9 to go into tourism accommodation use, then were they to be granted planning permission and then subsequently want to move away from tourism accommodation use, that would be subject to policy E8. But if that premises was never in a tourism accommodation area, because it was in a different part of the island altogether from the Sandown and Shanklin locations, then it could come forward for planning permission under E9, and if it secured a planning permission under E9, that would be the limit of it. That wouldn't, as it were, bring it into E8, because E8 is geographically limited only to those areas. So if, I don't know, somewhere in Ryde got a planning permission under E9, the fact that it was then in tourism accommodation use wouldn't bring it within that limb of E8 in relation to the limb that we were talking about.
So sorry, Mr. Bedford, so the final part of E8
Yeah.
has to be read with the preceding paragraph. It's not a standalone. Is this the concern that others have, that potentially if you then find yourself in a position where you've got a restrictive condition around tourism accommodation under E9, you're not within the tourism accommodation area, you could be in Ryde, you could be somewhere else. To come out of that, you potentially could be caught by the final sentence of E8.
Yes,
I think-
sorry, I'm
sorry.
sorry. It's my fault for not making myself clear enough as to the two different limbs. I thought that the concern that was being expressed by the representatives was that by virtue of a permission under E9, they would be brought within the penultimate sentence of E8, which was what we were previously debating, which was about the tourism accommodation areas. I appreciate that if you had an E9 planning permission, which did have a restriction on its conditions, that would fall within the last sentence of E8. So I say, I thought I was directing my answers to a particular problem rather than to that one. So I apologise if I was not making myself as clear as I should have been.
Unless I'm advised to the alternative, is that the concern from others, that although E9 does say any such change of use applications will only be supported within the core tourism accommodation areas or identified through neighbourhood plans or outside of, so there's potentially other areas outside of the core, you get an approval under E9, you could find yourself the challenge of coming back to call it ordinary C3 residential
And
accommodation.
it goes, will only be permitted to change back in exceptional circumstances. And that's exceptional circumstances, then go back to viability of the use. And it will create a problem.
I think this is something we do, maybe not now here in this room, but maybe I can leave this with the council to think if we're unintentionally creating something quite onerous.
Could just come in on a quick point as well, just turning to the second paragraph of E9, as you touched on. So we're saying that any such change of use applications will only be supported in the core tourism areas which we've covered or identified through neighbourhood plans or outside these areas where there is no adverse impact on existing residential properties. So there's a few problems with this as a starter. This is a document for growth and about how the island grows and expands for the future. And a key part of that is tourism. If we're looking at these being clearly defined on a map, and we've already established that we've got some of the policies about our mapping about our tourism areas wrong, and we've discussed in the room today that actually that holiday accommodation and the way that it's changing is changing, and it isn't just about pinpointing places on a map. But that has a problem in terms of, therefore, where it's acceptable to put this, if we're going to look at granting permissions for these things. But the second problem with that is that within neighbourhood plans, establishing tourism areas, well, crikey, I mean, that's going to be about as popular as getting neighbourhood plans out of neighbourhoods to put gypsies and travellers in them. I can't see people locally wanting to support that policy. But then comes into another concern with that last paragraph. I live in an area that's predicated by second homes. Now, by nature, that area is noisy in the summer, and that's because people are coming to the island on holiday and they're having fun in the evening. And they're not going to work in the morning, so they're not thinking about what time they stay up late till. That's a factor of holiday accommodation. And if you then look at that last sentence, where there is no adverse impact on existing residential properties, well, it just jars one with the other. You couldn't possibly consent to holiday use in a residential area. Now, that to me is a problem. I think the point that David touched on earlier is that Airbnb accommodation, there have been a lot of properties that have come forward that won't sustain in the long term as holiday accommodation because they're simply not appropriate for it. They're not in an area that's desirable for people to holiday in. But in areas where it is desirable for people to holiday and they will sustain and they will flourish as businesses if we allow them to do that. And it's right for us as a tourism-led island to be allowing them to flourish. And I think the policy is written, it does not work. It doesn't allow the opportunity to get consent. And if we are within a core area, as David highlighted, it doesn't allow the opportunity to get out of that consent through any other change that occurs. There's just too much restriction on this, and we're trying to control something that we don't readily understand. And I think that really is the issue.
Mr. Farrell? Thank you. I think I've heard quite a bit about this particular policy area. There are clearly soundness concerns. I think following this discussion, obviously go back to look at the EC3 paper. I think this probably is an area that myself and Mr. Steve will have to look at a bit more carefully and give a steer, as the council say, in terms of potential kind of way forward. I'll also have to check back through the integrated sustainability appraisal in terms of what sort of options have been looked at. I mean, I've kind of sitting here now kind of floated the kind of potential of whether this is a policy area that kind of needs to wait and be picked up as part of, you know, a plan review in the short to in the immediate kind of term, or whether there may be further sort of modifications that might be needed to kind of help this policy area be effective and justified. I think it's probably going to be sort of on a practical level quite a difficult policy area to implement for the authority. We'll look into that further. Thank you for that. I'm going to draw a line under discussion on policy E9. I'm clear on the soundness issues that people have raised. I just want to finish today on retail. Just very briefly, it was issue 4. Really just to pick up with the council, the proposed modifications to policy E7 in response to MIQ 8.12. So can I understand, I don't know, again, I'm looking in the first instance to Mr. Brewer. So this is effectively to put in the retail or network and hierarchy of centres across the island, drawn from presumably the latest retail study evidence.
Yes, so that's correct. So the proposed change set out in 8.12 in our hearing statement is effectively just to take the table 8.2 and make it appear in policy. And obviously that being a strategic policy as well, then obviously that has the knock-on implications then in terms of those centres being set out in a strategic policy, which we think is required rather than being in supporting text. So it's explicit and clear what our retail hierarchy is within policy.
Thank you, and we'll take a view on whether that's a main modification or a clarificatory additional modification. I'm probably someone who is more on the side of caution of putting it as a main mod, and then people have got the opportunity to comment on that. And then just finally on, it's kind of allied to retail. I haven't lost sight through core documents 7. I think the council had agreed some modifications with Historic England in relation to policies E7, E11. And again, we'll take a view as to whether they're main modifications or additional. Thank you. I'm probably now going to draw a line under today's discussion there is one matter we haven't really discussed today, which is the Gypsy and Traveller matter 2, issue 5. I think it's really probably from recollection, I think probably just discussion with ourselves and the council, rather than have it now at 5:05 on the first day. We'll factor that into the programme at a convenient point during the next 2 weeks to kind of look at that. It may fit in with when we come to look at the, excuse me, the housing policies and policy H11, kind of maybe fit better with that. Okay. Okay, I thank everybody for their contributions today. Apologies, we've sat a little bit later than I think we were originally intending, but that's been a useful discussion for us and contributions. And again, thank you to the council for their approach to this. We reconvene back in this room for the early start of 9 o'clock for housing numbers and housing requirements, which will be quite a long session, I feel. And then following in the afternoon, if we haven't had enough, with spatial strategy. So a long strategic day tomorrow, and I might see some other people for that discussion as well. So we'll see you again tomorrow morning back in this room for 9 o'clock. Thank you.